Hello everyone and God bless you. In this video we bring to you the story of one of the most well-known characters in the Bible, Joseph. Close your eyes and picture a coat of many colors, shimmering in the sunlight. This beautiful garment, a gift of love, became a symbol of jealousy that would change Joseph's life forever. As you relax and listen to Joseph's story unfold, let the vivid imagery transport you to ancient times. From the depths of a pit to the grandeur of Pharaoh's court, this journey will captivate your imagination and soothe your spirit as you drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I thought it would be a fun idea if you could leave a comment below to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also remember to like the video and subscribe if you want to hear more like this. Okay, let's get comfy, relaxed and let's begin. Chapter 1. A Father's Favorite. Picture a young boy with bright eyes and a kind smile. This is Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, a man blessed by God. Joseph is different from his brothers, not just because of his vibrant coat, but because of the special place he holds in his father's heart. Jacob's love for Joseph runs deep, like a river flowing through the desert. He cherishes this son born to him in his old age, the firstborn of his beloved wife Rachel. Can you feel the warmth of Jacob's affection as he looks upon Joseph with pride? But this love, so beautiful in its intensity, casts a shadow over the family. Jacob's clear favoritism towards Joseph causes tension among the brothers. They watch as their father lavishes attention on Joseph, giving him gifts and responsibilities beyond his years. The colorful coat, a symbol of Jacob's love, becomes a source of bitter resentment for Joseph's brothers. As the days pass, the brothers' jealousy grows like a thorny vine, wrapping around their hearts. They see Joseph as their father's pet, the spoiled dreamer who thinks he's better than them. Their bitterness turns to anger, simmering just beneath the surface. One day, Joseph shares a dream that pushes his brothers to the brink. In this dream, he sees himself as superior, standing above them all. Can you imagine how this makes them feel? Their younger brother, already their father's favorite, now claims he will rule over them? Joseph's words fan the flames of their hatred. They see him as arrogant, full of himself, undeserving of the love and attention he receives. The brothers' anger reaches a boiling point, their hearts hardening against their young sibling. As Joseph approaches them in the fields one day, unaware of the storm brewing within his brothers, they make a fateful decision. The sight of him, perhaps wearing that colorful coat, ignites their fury. In that moment, blinded by jealousy and rage, they choose a path that will change all their lives forever. Their faces darken with malice as Joseph draws near. Can you sense the tension in the air, thick and heavy like the heat before a desert storm? Joseph, innocent and trusting, walks into danger, unaware of the hatred that has taken root in his brothers' hearts. What will happen next? As you rest there, let your mind wander to those sun-baked fields where Joseph's brothers wait. Feel the weight of their decision, the consequences that will ripple through time. In this moment, on the cusp of a terrible act, the story of Joseph truly begins to unfold. Chapter 2. Betrayal in the Desert. As the sun-baked fields hold a secret, one that will change Joseph's life forever, a terrible act awaits this unsuspecting young man. Joseph approaches his brothers, unaware of their dark intentions. How far will jealousy push them? The answer lies in the harsh desert air, thick with tension. Joseph walks towards his brothers, his colorful coat catching the sunlight. He smiles, eager to see them. But their faces are like stone, cold and unmoving. Suddenly, rough hands grab him. Joseph struggles, confused and frightened. "What are you doing?" he cries out. But his brothers' eyes are filled with hatred. They tear at his precious coat, the symbol of their father's love. Joseph feels the fabric rip away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Some of the brothers, their anger boiling over, want to kill him right there. "Let's be rid of this dreamer once and for all," they shout. But Reuben, the eldest, speaks up. "No, we shouldn't kill him," he says. "There's a pit nearby. Let's throw him in there instead." Reuben plans to rescue Joseph later, but he doesn't share this with the others. The brothers agree, and they drag Joseph to the edge of the pit. Joseph pleads with them, his voice breaking. "Please, brothers, don't do this! Why are you treating me this way?" But his cries fall on deaf ears. They push him into the dark, empty cistern. Joseph lands hard at the bottom, bruised and terrified. He looks up at the circle of sky above, wondering if he'll ever see his father again. As Joseph sits in the darkness, he hears a faint sound in the distance. It grows louder, the tinkling of bells, the creak of wooden wheels. A caravan of traders appears on the horizon, their camels laden with goods bound for Egypt. Judah, one of the brothers, has an idea. "Why should we leave him here to die?" he asks. "Let's sell him to these traders instead. We'll be rid of him, and we'll make some money too." The others nod in agreement, seeing the opportunity before them. They pull Joseph from the pit. His eyes are wide with fear as he sees the approaching caravan. "Please," he begs one last time. "I'm your brother." But their hearts are hardened. For 20 pieces of silver, the price of a young slave, they hand Joseph over to the traders. As the caravan moves away, Joseph looks back at his brothers. Tears stream down his face as he realizes the full weight of their betrayal. The colorful coat, now torn and dirty, lies discarded on the ground. It's the last glimpse Joseph has of his old life as he's led away to an uncertain future in Egypt. How did Joseph end up sold into slavery in Egypt? Through a tragic series of events driven by jealousy, hatred, and betrayal. His own brothers, consumed by envy, turned against him. What began as a journey to visit his family ended with Joseph bound for a foreign land, stripped of his identity, and separated from everything he knew and loved. Chapter 3. A slave in a strange land. Imagine being ripped from everything you've ever known and thrust into a completely alien world. For Joseph, this nightmare became reality. But sometimes, the darkest moments can lead to the brightest transformations. What unexpected blessings await Joseph in the land of the Pharaohs? As Joseph arrives in Egypt, he's overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of this strange new land. The towering pyramids and grand temples loom over bustling marketplaces filled with people speaking a language he doesn't understand. Can you picture how small and alone he must feel? Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an important officer of Pharaoh. As he's led to his new master's house, Joseph's mind races. Will Potiphar be cruel? What kind of work will he be forced to do? But Joseph remembers the faith his father taught him, and he decides to trust in God's plan, even in this difficult situation. Despite his circumstances, Joseph chooses to work hard and do his best. He learns the language, adapts to Egyptian customs, and puts all his effort into his tasks. Potiphar begins to notice this young Hebrew slave who seems different from the others. Joseph's diligence and integrity shine through in everything he does. As time passes, Potiphar sees that Joseph is trustworthy and capable. He puts Joseph in charge of his entire household. Can you imagine how this must have felt for Joseph? From a slave in chains to managing a high-ranking official's estate, God was clearly with him, blessing his work. But just when things seem to be looking up for Joseph, a new challenge arises. Potiphar's wife takes notice of the handsome young man running her household. She begins to flirt with Joseph, trying to seduce him. Day after day, she pursues him, becoming more and more insistent. Joseph finds himself in a difficult position. He's grateful to Potiphar and doesn't want to betray his master's trust. More importantly, he knows that giving in to Potiphar's wife would be a sin against God. So Joseph resists her advances, staying true to his principles and his faith. One day, when they are alone in the house, Potiphar's wife makes her boldest move yet. She grabs Joseph's cloak, demanding that he sleep with her. Joseph is faced with a critical choice. In that moment, he chooses integrity over temptation. He pulls away, leaving his cloak in her hands as he flees from the house. Furious at being rejected, Potiphar's wife cries out, claiming that Joseph tried to attack her. She shows his cloak as evidence, twisting the truth to paint Joseph as the villain. When Potiphar hears his wife's false accusation, his anger burns against Joseph. Without a trial or a chance to defend himself, Joseph is thrown into prison. Once again, He finds himself unjustly punished, his world turned upside down. As the heavy iron doors clang shut, Joseph might wonder if God has forgotten him. What challenges did Joseph face as a slave in a foreign land? He had to adapt to a new culture and language, prove himself trustworthy to his master, resist temptation, and face false accusations. Through it all, Joseph's faith and integrity were tested. Yet even in prison, God's plan for Joseph was just beginning to unfold. Chapter 4. Dreams in the Dungeon. Have you ever wondered how a single ability could transform someone's life? For Joseph, locked away in an Egyptian prison, his unique gift was about to open doors he never imagined possible. Joseph found himself in a dark, damp prison cell, a far cry from the comforts of his father's house. The stone walls echoed with the groans of other prisoners, and the air was thick with despair. But even here, in this place of confinement, Joseph's character shone through like a beacon of light. As days turned into weeks, Joseph's integrity and wisdom caught the attention of the prison warden. Impressed by the young Hebrew's reliability, the warden put Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. Can you picture Joseph, moving through the dim corridors, offering words of comfort to his fellow inmates? His kindness and leadership lifted the spirits of those around him, even in this gloomy place. One day, the monotony of prison life was interrupted by the arrival of two new prisoners. These weren't ordinary criminals, they were Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, two high-ranking officials who had fallen from grace. Joseph couldn't help but wonder what had brought these men to share his fate. As Joseph tended to his duties, he noticed something troubling the new arrivals. Their faces were etched with worry, their eyes distant and unfocused. When he asked what was wrong, they shared a common problem: both had experienced vivid, unsettling dreams the night before, but they couldn't make sense of them. Joseph listened intently as the cupbearer and baker described their dreams. The images they shared were strange and symbolic, filled with numbers and objects that seemed to hold hidden meaning. As they spoke, Joseph felt a familiar stirring in his heart, the same feeling he had experienced with his own prophetic dreams so long ago. With compassion in his voice, Joseph offered to help interpret their dreams. But before he began, he made sure to give credit where it was due. "Don't interpretations belong to God?" he asked them. Even in prison, Joseph's faith remained unshaken, and he wanted to make it clear that any insight he might offer came from a higher source. As Joseph unraveled the meaning of their dreams, the cupbearer and baker listened with growing amazement. To the cupbearer, Joseph predicted restoration to his former position. But for the baker, the news was grim. His dream foretold his execution. 3 days later, just as Joseph had interpreted, both dreams came true. The cupbearer was restored to his position, once again serving wine in Pharaoh's court. The baker, sadly, met the fate Joseph had foreseen. How did Joseph's ability to interpret dreams change his fate in prison? While it didn't immediately secure his release, it planted a seed of hope. Joseph had demonstrated a gift that set him apart, a connection to divine wisdom that even Pharaoh's officials recognized. This ability, once a source of trouble with his brothers, was now revealing itself as a powerful tool that could shape his future. As the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph asked him to remember him and mention his case to Pharaoh. Little did Joseph know that this small request, born from his gift of interpretation, would one day lead to an opportunity beyond his wildest dreams. But for now, Joseph remained in prison, holding on to his faith and waiting for God's plan to unfold. Chapter 5. Forgotten but not forsaken. Joseph's request faded into memory. A new chapter of waiting began. Have you ever felt like your prayers were lost in silence? For Joseph, the next 2 years would test the very limits of his faith and patience. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Joseph found himself still behind the cold stone walls of the prison. The initial spark of hope that had flared when the cupbearer left began to dim. Each morning, Joseph would wake up, wondering if today would be the day his freedom would come. But as the sun set each evening, he remained in his cell, forgotten by the outside world. 2 full years passed, each day a test of Joseph's resilience. Can you imagine the weight of time pressing down on him? The temptation to give in to despair must have been strong. Yet, Even as the world seemed to have forgotten him, Joseph held on to a profound truth: God had not abandoned him. In the quiet moments of his confinement, Joseph could feel God's presence. It was there in the small kindnesses he shared with fellow prisoners, in the wisdom he offered to those in need. Joseph continued to use his gifts, interpreting dreams and offering comfort to those around him. His faith, tested by the long silence, grew deeper roots. Picture Joseph in his cell, perhaps sitting on a rough mat, his eyes closed in prayer. Despite the circumstances, a sense of peace surrounds him. He doesn't know why God has allowed this prolonged imprisonment, but he trusts that there's a greater purpose at work. As the days stretched on, Joseph's faith was put to the test time and time again. There were moments of doubt, times when he questioned why God seemed silent. But in those dark hours, Joseph would remember the dreams of his youth, the promises God had shown him. He clung to hope, believing that someday, somehow, God would fulfill his plan. Little did Joseph know that his moment was about to come. As he went about his daily routine in the prison, events were unfolding in Pharaoh's palace that would change everything. God's timing, perfect as always, was about to reveal itself in a dramatic way. Pharaoh himself was about to have a dream so vivid and disturbing that it would shake the most powerful man in Egypt to his core. This dream would be the key that would unlock Joseph's cell door, setting in motion a chain of events beyond anything he could have imagined. As you rest there, think about Joseph's unwavering faith during those long years of waiting. His story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel forgotten by the world, God is still at work. He hasn't abandoned us. Like Joseph, we can choose to trust in God's timing, knowing that He can turn our trials into triumphs. So close your eyes and picture Joseph, peaceful despite his circumstances, unaware that his life is about to change forever. Let His patience and faith wash over you, bringing a sense of calm to your spirit as you drift towards sleep. Chapter 6. Pharaoh's Troubling Dreams. Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so unsettling, that it left you shaken to your core? Pharaoh was about to experience just such a dream, one that would puzzle the wisest minds in Egypt and set in motion events that would alter the course of history. In the opulent chambers of his palace, Pharaoh tossed and turned, his sleep disturbed by strange and troubling visions. As the first light of dawn crept across the sky, he awoke with a start, his heart racing. The images from his dreams clung to his mind like cobwebs, refusing to fade away. Pharaoh called for his advisors, his voice urgent and filled with concern. As they gathered around him, he recounted the bizarre scenes that had played out in his sleep. In the first dream, he had stood by the Nile, watching as 7 fat, healthy cows emerged from the river. They were beautiful animals, sleek and well-fed. But then, to Pharaoh's horror, 7 other cows appeared. These were ugly and gaunt, their ribs visible beneath their skin. In a shocking turn of events, the thin cows devoured the fat ones, leaving no trace behind. But the dreams didn't end there. Pharaoh described a second vision, equally perplexing. He had seen 7 heads of grain, plump and golden, growing on a single stalk. It was a sight that would normally bring joy to any ruler, promising a bountiful harvest. But then, 7 other heads of grain sprouted. These were thin and scorched by the east wind. And just like the cows, the thin heads of grain swallowed up the plump ones. Can you imagine the confusion and fear that gripped Pharaoh as he shared these dreams? The most powerful man in Egypt, accustomed to having all the answers, now found himself at a loss. He looked to his wise men and magicians, hoping they could unravel the mystery of these visions. But as each advisor shook their head in bewilderment, Pharaoh's anxiety grew. The palace buzzed with tension as the day wore on. Pharaoh paced the halls, the images from his dreams replaying in his mind. What could they mean? Were they a warning? A prophecy? The fate of Egypt could hang in the balance, and yet no one could offer an explanation. It was in this moment of desperation that a memory stirred in the mind of Pharaoh's cupbearer. 2 years had passed since his own unsettling dream had been interpreted in prison. The young Hebrew slave who had helped him, what was his name? Joseph. Yes, that was it. The cupbearer approached Pharaoh, his voice hesitant but hopeful. My lord, he began. "I am reminded today of my own failings." The cupbearer recounted his time in prison and the remarkable young man who had interpreted his dream with astounding accuracy. Pharaoh listened intently, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. Without hesitation, Pharaoh ordered Joseph to be brought from the prison. Can you picture the scene? Joseph, who had been languishing in darkness for years, was suddenly rushed from his cell. He was quickly cleaned up and given fresh clothes, his appearance transformed to stand before the mighty Pharaoh. As Joseph entered the grand hall, his eyes adjusting to the bright light, he found himself face to face with the ruler of Egypt. Pharaoh, his voice tinged with both authority and desperation, recounted his troubling dreams. Joseph listened carefully, his mind already turning over the symbols and their possible meanings. What was Pharaoh's dream that Joseph would interpret? It was a vivid warning, cloaked in the language of dreams, of plenty and famine, of abundance and scarcity. As Joseph prepared to speak, the fate of Egypt and his own destiny hung in the balance. The wisdom of God was about to flow through this once forgotten prisoner, changing the course of history forever. Chapter 7. Divine Interpretation. Imagine the tension in Pharaoh's court as Joseph stood before the most powerful man in Egypt. The young Hebrew, once a prisoner, now faced the opportunity to interpret the dreams that had baffled the wisest minds in the land. Joseph's heart raced, but his faith remained steady. He knew that any wisdom he possessed came from God alone. With humility and reverence, Joseph spoke. "It is not in me," he said softly, his eyes meeting Pharaoh's. "God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Can you feel the weight of those words? Joseph, standing before the man considered a living god by the Egyptians, boldly proclaimed the power of the true God. As Joseph began to unravel the mystery of Pharaoh's dreams, the court fell silent. He explained that the 7 fat cows and 7 plump ears of grain represented 7 years of abundance. Egypt would experience a time of great plenty, with harvests more bountiful than anyone could remember. But this was only half of the message. Joseph's voice grew somber as he continued. The 7 thin cows and 7 withered ears of grain foretold 7 years of severe famine. This famine would be so harsh that it would consume all the abundance of the previous years. Can you imagine the fear that must have gripped Pharaoh's heart as he heard these words? But Joseph didn't stop at interpretation. Guided by divine wisdom, he offered a solution. "Let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man," Joseph suggested, his voice clear and confident. "And let him appoint overseers to collect 1/5 of the produce during the 7 years of abundance." As you picture this scene, think of the courage it took for Joseph to offer advice to Pharaoh. Yet his words flowed with a certainty that came from above. He outlined a plan to store the excess grain, creating a reserve that would sustain Egypt through the coming famine. Pharaoh listened intently, his eyes never leaving Joseph's face. The young man before him spoke with a wisdom far beyond his years. As Joseph finished speaking, a hush fell over the court. Everyone waited to see how Pharaoh would respond to this bold interpretation and unexpected counsel. To the amazement of all present, Pharaoh's face broke into a smile. "Can we find anyone like this man?" he declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh recognized the divine source of Joseph's wisdom, and in that moment, a decision was made that would change Joseph's life forever. As you rest there, think about how God's plan for Joseph was finally being revealed. After years of hardship and waiting, Joseph's gift was being used to save not just Egypt, but many nations. It's a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, God can be preparing us for something greater than we could ever imagine. Chapter 8. From Prisoner to Prince. God's plan for Joseph was unfolding, but the most dramatic chapter was yet to come. In mere moments, this former slave and prisoner would experience a transformation so profound, it would leave the entire Egyptian court in awe. What happened next would change not just Joseph's life, but the course of history itself. Pharaoh, his eyes shining with newfound hope, looked at Joseph with wonder. He recognized something extraordinary in this young Hebrew, the unmistakable presence of God's Spirit. Can you imagine the hushed silence that fell over the court as Pharaoh spoke? "Since God has shown you all this," he declared, his voice ringing with authority, "there is no one so discerning and wise as you." In that moment, Joseph's world shifted. Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's God-given wisdom, made a decision that would astound everyone present. He appointed Joseph to oversee the entire land of Egypt, second in command only to Pharaoh himself. Picture the looks of astonishment on the faces of the courtiers as they witnessed this unprecedented rise to power. To symbolize Joseph's new authority, Pharaoh did something remarkable. He removed his own signet ring, the seal of his power, and placed it on Joseph's finger. Can you feel the weight of that ring, both physically and symbolically? With this gesture, Pharaoh was entrusting Joseph with the power to make decisions on behalf of Egypt itself. But the transformation wasn't complete yet. Joseph, who had spent years in prison rags, was now dressed in fine linen garments, fit for a ruler. Around his neck, Pharaoh placed a gold chain, another sign of his high office. The contrast must have been staggering, from chains of imprisonment to chains of gold. At just 30 years old, Joseph found himself in a position of immense power and responsibility. Pharaoh had him ride in the chariot reserved for his second-in-command, and heralds ran ahead, shouting for people to bow before him. Can you picture Joseph, overwhelmed by this sudden change, as he processed through the streets of Egypt? To fully integrate Joseph into Egyptian society, Pharaoh gave him a new name, Zaphenath-Paneah. This name, meaning, "God speaks and lives," reflected Joseph's divine gift of interpretation. Pharaoh also arranged a marriage for Joseph to Asenath, the daughter of a prominent priest. These acts served to cement Joseph's place in the highest echelons of Egyptian society. Joseph's transformation was complete. From a favored son to a slave, from a prisoner to a prince, his journey had been extraordinary. As you rest there, think about the incredible way God had worked in Joseph's life. Through every hardship, every setback, God had been preparing Joseph for this moment. How did Joseph rise to become a ruler in Egypt? Through a series of events that could only be orchestrated by God. His gift of dream interpretation, once a source of trouble with his brothers, became the key to his elevation. His years of faithful service, even in the lowest circumstances, had prepared him to lead with wisdom and integrity. And through it all, Joseph's unwavering faith in God had sustained him, bringing him to a position where he could save not just Egypt, but his own family and the future nation of Israel. As you drift toward sleep, remember Joseph's incredible journey. It reminds us that God can use our challenges and setbacks to prepare us for purposes beyond our imagination. Even in our darkest moments, God is working, shaping us for a future we can't yet see. Chapter 9. Preparing for Famine. Imagine being entrusted with the fate of an entire nation. For Joseph, this wasn't just a metaphor. As he gazed out over Egypt's fertile fields, he knew a devastating secret. 7 years of abundance stretched before Egypt like a golden dream. But Joseph knew this dream would turn into a nightmare unless he acted swiftly. What strategy would he use to save countless lives? Joseph wasted no time. With the weight of his responsibility heavy on his shoulders, he set out across Egypt. Picture him traveling from city to city, his eyes scanning the lush landscapes. In each place, he carefully assessed the harvest and put his plan into action. Can you see the determination in his eyes as he explains his strategy to local officials? At the heart of Joseph's plan was a simple yet brilliant idea. He implemented a system to store 1/5 of all produce during the years of plenty. Imagine the hustle and bustle as workers gathered the excess grain, carefully preserving it for the future. Joseph's foresight was transforming Egypt, one granary at a time. Speaking of granaries, have you ever tried to picture just how massive they must have been? These weren't small storehouses, but enormous structures capable of holding years' worth of grain. As you rest there, try to imagine the scale of these buildings rising across Egypt. They stood as testament to Joseph's wisdom and Pharaoh's trust in him. For 7 years, the land produced abundantly, just as Joseph had predicted. The fields were heavy with crops, the harvests more bountiful than anyone could remember. It must have been a joyous time for the Egyptian people. But amidst the celebration, Joseph remained focused on the future. His careful management ensured that not a single grain went to waste. As the years of plenty came to an end, can you feel the tension building in the air? The people of Egypt, accustomed to abundance, began to wonder if Joseph's prediction of famine would really come true. Some may have doubted, questioning the need for such vast stores of grain. But Joseph remained steadfast, trusting in the divine wisdom that had guided him. What strategy did Joseph use to save Egypt from famine? It was a plan built on wisdom, foresight, and careful management. By storing 1/5 of the produce during the good years, Joseph created a buffer against the coming hardship. His system of centralized storage and distribution would ensure that food remained available even when the fields lay barren. As you drift towards sleep, think about Joseph's incredible foresight. His ability to plan for the future, even in times of abundance, would soon prove to be Egypt's salvation. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes, the seeds of our future success are planted long before we see the fruits of our labor. Joseph's story teaches us the value of preparation and the importance of using our God-given wisdom to help others. Chapter 10. The famine begins. The famine Joseph predicted arrives with a vengeance. As the sun rises over Egypt, a new day dawns, but the fields remain eerily silent. Where once stood lush crops, now only parched earth remains. How will Joseph's plan unfold in the face of this impending crisis? Just as Joseph foretold, the crops begin to fail. The Nile, usually a source of life and abundance, doesn't flood as it should. Fields that once flourished now lie dry and barren. Can you picture the worried faces of farmers as they survey their withered plants? The sight must have filled their hearts with dread. As hunger begins to gnaw at the people, they turn to Joseph for help. Word spreads quickly through the land there's food in the royal storehouses. People from all corners of Egypt make their way to Joseph, hope mingling with desperation in their eyes. Imagine the long lines forming, as families wait for their share of grain. Joseph's years of careful planning now pay off. He opens the massive granaries, revealing mountains of stored grain. The people gasp in amazement at the sight. Joseph's foresight has saved them from immediate starvation. Can you feel the wave of relief washing over the crowd? As Joseph oversees the distribution, his wisdom shines through. He ensures that the food is given out fairly, making sure that all receive what they need to survive. Picture Joseph, moving among the people, offering words of comfort along with life-saving grain. His compassion touches hearts even as his planning saves lives. News of Egypt's abundance spreads beyond its borders. In neighboring lands, where the famine also rages, people hear whispers of hope. There's food in Egypt, they say to one another. Soon, caravans from distant places begin to arrive, seeking to buy grain. Joseph's actions are saving not just Egypt, but surrounding nations as well. Throughout it all, Joseph manages the crisis with a steady hand. He rations the grain carefully, knowing that the famine will last for years. His wisdom in distribution ensures that the food will last, even as he provides for those in need. Can you imagine the weight of responsibility on Joseph's shoulders? Yet he bears it with grace and faith. As the days turn into weeks, and weeks into months, Joseph's efforts save countless lives. Families who might have perished now have food on their tables. Children who might have starved play in the streets, their laughter a testament to Joseph's foresight. The people of Egypt, once fearful, now look to the future with hope. But even as Joseph tackles this enormous challenge, a greater test of his character looms on the horizon. As you rest there, think about the incredible journey that brought Joseph to this moment. From a pit in Canaan to the second highest position in Egypt, God has been preparing him for this time. Now, as Joseph faces his greatest challenge yet, how will his faith and wisdom be put to the test? Chapter 11. Brothers in Need. Little did Joseph know that his next challenge would come not from Egypt, but from his past. Imagine the shock on Joseph's face as he sees 10 familiar figures bowing before him, men he never thought he'd see again. How will he react to this sudden reunion? The famine that Joseph had predicted reached far beyond Egypt's borders. In Canaan, Joseph's homeland, the situation grew dire. Fields that once flourished now lay barren, and families struggled to find enough food to survive. Jacob, Joseph's father, heard whispers of hope there was grain in Egypt. With no other choice, he gathered his sons and sent them on a journey to buy food. Picture the 10 brothers as they approached the grand Egyptian palace. Their clothes were dusty from travel, their faces etched with worry. As they entered the throne room, they bowed low before the Egyptian ruler, not realizing they were prostrating themselves before their long-lost brother. Joseph's heart raced as he recognized them instantly. Can you imagine the flood of memories that washed over him? The coat of many colors, the dreams that sparked their jealousy, the pit they threw him into, it all came rushing back. Yet there he sat, dressed in fine Egyptian garments, while they knelt before him, unaware of his true identity. In that moment, Joseph made a decision. He spoke to them harshly, his voice stern and accusing. "You are spies!" he declared, watching their reactions closely. "You have come to see where our land is unprotected." The brothers, taken aback by this accusation, protested vehemently. They insisted they were honest men, all sons of one father in Canaan. As the brothers pleaded their case, they revealed information about their family. They spoke of their youngest brother who had stayed behind with their father, and of another brother who was no more. Joseph listened intently, his mind racing. Benjamin was alive. And his father, did they truly mourn him as they claimed? Joseph's heart ached to reveal himself, to embrace his brothers and forgive them. But something held him back. He needed to know if they had changed, if the jealousy and cruelty that had torn their family apart still lurked in their hearts. As you rest there, think about the complexity of Joseph's emotions in this moment. After years of separation, his brothers stood before him, completely at his mercy. The tables had turned dramatically. How would you feel in Joseph's position? Would you seek revenge or offer forgiveness? Joseph's mind whirled as he formed a plan to test his brothers. He would push them to their limits, to see if they had truly changed. It would be a test of their character, their loyalty to their family, and their capacity for selflessness. Little did the brothers know that their actions in the coming days would determine not just their fate, but the future of their entire family. Chapter 12. A Test of Character. With his plan in motion, Joseph set the stage for a dramatic test of character. What would happen when he pushed his brothers to their absolute limits? The answer would determine not just their fate, but the future of their entire family. Joseph's voice rang out clear and firm as he made his demand. "Bring your youngest brother to me," he ordered, his eyes scanning the faces of his brothers. "Only then will I believe you are not spies." Can you imagine the shock and fear that rippled through the group? They had come for food, but now faced an impossible choice. To ensure their compliance, Joseph kept Simeon as a hostage. Picture the anguish on Simeon's face as his brothers were forced to leave him behind. With heavy hearts, the brothers began their journey back to Canaan, their sacks filled with grain but their minds troubled by what had transpired. When they arrived home, they faced the daunting task of explaining everything to their father, Jacob. As they recounted their experience, Jacob's face grew pale with worry. "You have bereaved me of my children," he cried out. "Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin." Can you feel the pain in Jacob's voice, the fear of losing another son? Jacob refused to let Benjamin go, his heart unable to bear the thought of losing Rachel's only remaining son. But as the days passed and their food supplies dwindled, the family faced a grim reality. They needed to return to Egypt for more grain, or they would starve. It was Judah who finally stepped forward, offering himself as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. "Send the boy with me," he pleaded with his father. "I will be personally responsible for him." Imagine the determination in Judah's eyes as he made this promise. His words showed a change of heart, a willingness to sacrifice himself for his younger brother. Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. As the brothers prepared for their return to Egypt, can you picture the mix of fear and resolve on their faces? They knew the dangers that lay ahead, but they had no choice. Their family's survival depended on this journey. When they arrived in Egypt and stood before Joseph once again, his eyes immediately sought out Benjamin. Seeing his younger brother, Joseph was overcome with emotion. He had to hurry from the room to compose himself, his heart pounding with the desire to reveal his true identity. But Joseph knew his test wasn't complete. He needed to be certain his brothers had truly changed. As he prepared one final challenge, Joseph's mind raced with possibilities. Would they abandon Benjamin as they had abandoned him so many years ago? Or would they stand together as a family, united in the face of adversity? As you rest there, think about the transformation happening in Joseph's brothers. Their actions in the coming moments would reveal whether they had learned from their past mistakes. Joseph's test would push them to their limits, forcing them to confront their own character and values. How do you think they will respond when faced with the ultimate choice? Chapter 13. The Silver Cup. The silver cup gleamed in the depths of Benjamin's sack, a silent witness to Joseph's final test. As the brothers prepared to leave Egypt, their hearts were light with relief. Their meeting with the powerful Egyptian ruler had gone well. They had secured the grain they desperately needed, and Simeon had been released. Best of all, Benjamin was safe and ready to return home to their father. Little did they know that Joseph had set one last challenge in motion. As the brothers made their way out of the city, the sun warm on their backs, Joseph's steward hurried after them. His shouts pierced the air, accusing them of a terrible crime. "Why have you repaid good with evil?" he demanded, his voice filled with anger. "You have stolen my master's silver cup!" The brothers were stunned. They protested their innocence, their voices rising in confusion and fear. "We would never do such a thing!" they cried. In their confidence, they made a bold claim. "If you find the cup with any of us, let that person die, and the rest of us will become your slaves." The steward agreed to search their sacks. Can you picture the scene? One by one, he opened each bag, starting with the oldest brother. The tension grew with each sack that was emptied. When he reached Benjamin's sack, the brothers held their breath. And then, the unthinkable happened. The silver cup emerged, glinting in the sunlight. Imagine the shock and despair that washed over the brothers. They tore their clothes in anguish, a sign of deep distress. How could this be happening? They knew Benjamin was innocent, yet the evidence seemed irrefutable. With heavy hearts, they loaded their donkeys and returned to the city, fear gripping their souls. Back in Joseph's house, they fell to the ground before him. Joseph's voice was stern as he confronted them. "What is this you have done?" he demanded. "Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" Judah stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. "What can we say?" he asked. "How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered our guilt." In that moment, Judah offered himself and his brothers as slaves to Joseph. But Joseph had other plans. "Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave," he declared. "The rest of you may go back to your father in peace." This was the moment of truth. Would the brothers abandon Benjamin as they had abandoned Joseph so many years ago? As you rest there, imagine the weight of this decision. The brothers' response would reveal whether they had truly changed. Judah approached Joseph, his heart pounding. With passionate words, he explained how dear Benjamin was to their father. He recounted Jacob's grief over losing Joseph and how devastating it would be to lose Benjamin too. Then, in an act of selfless love, Judah offered himself in Benjamin's place. "Please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy," Judah pleaded, his voice filled with emotion. "Let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I cannot bear to see the misery that would come upon my father." As Joseph listened to Judah's impassioned speech, he saw the profound change in his brothers' hearts. The moment of truth had arrived, and his test was complete. The brothers who had once sold him into slavery were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other. Joseph's plan had revealed their transformation, setting the stage for a reunion beyond imagination. Chapter 14. The Great Revelation. Imagine the tension in the room as Joseph stood before his brothers, his emotions threatening to overflow. For years, he had hidden his true identity, but now, the moment of truth had arrived. Joseph could no longer contain himself. His heart raced as he made a decision that would change everything. With a trembling voice, Joseph ordered everyone out of the room except his brothers. Can you picture their confusion as the Egyptian officials hurried away, leaving them alone with this powerful ruler? The brothers exchanged nervous glances, wondering what was about to happen. Then, in a moment that must have felt like a dream, Joseph spoke words that shook his brothers to their core. "I am Joseph," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Is my father still alive?" The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The brothers stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of shock and fear. How could this be possible? The brother they had sold into slavery years ago now stood before them as one of the most powerful men in Egypt. Can you imagine the thoughts racing through their minds? They must have wondered if Joseph would seek revenge for their past cruelty. Seeing their terror, Joseph's heart softened. He beckoned them to come closer, his eyes filled with tears. "Don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here," he said gently, "because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." As Joseph explained how God had used their actions for a greater purpose, the brothers listened in amazement. He told them about the remaining years of famine and how God had sent him to Egypt to preserve their family. Can you feel the mix of relief and wonder washing over the brothers as they realized Joseph held no bitterness toward them? Tears flowed freely as Joseph embraced each of his brothers. Picture the scene as years of separation and pain melted away in those tender moments. The room that had once been filled with fear now echoed with sobs of joy and words of forgiveness. Benjamin, the youngest, clung to Joseph, overwhelmed by the reunion with the brother he barely remembered. As you rest there, imagine the powerful emotions coursing through the room. The brothers who had once plotted against Joseph now found themselves wrapped in his forgiving embrace. Joseph's forgiveness was complete and unconditional. He saw beyond their past actions to the divine plan that had brought him to this position of power. His words of reassurance showed the depth of his understanding and the strength of his faith. As the initial shock wore off, the brothers began to talk, their voices a mix of apologies, questions, and expressions of awe at Joseph's transformation. Joseph listened patiently, filling in the gaps of his remarkable journey from slave to ruler. Can you picture the animated conversation, the gestures of disbelief, the shared memories flooding back? In this moment of reconciliation, Joseph's dream from so long ago was fulfilled. His brothers had indeed bowed before him, but not in the way anyone could have imagined. God had taken their act of betrayal and woven it into a tapestry of salvation for their entire family and beyond. Chapter 15. Reunion with Jacob. After the joyous reunion with his brothers, Joseph's heart yearned for one more embrace, that of his beloved father, Jacob. With excitement bubbling in his chest, Joseph sent his brothers back to Canaan with a mission of hope. "Go, bring our father and your families to Egypt," he urged them, his eyes shining with anticipation. Pharaoh, moved by Joseph's story, offered a generous gift. "The best of all Egypt will be yours," he declared, ensuring the family would have a place of abundance to call home. Can you imagine the brothers' amazement at this turn of events? From fearing for their lives, they now carried news of salvation and prosperity. Back in Canaan, Jacob received the news with disbelief. "Joseph is alive?" he whispered, his weathered face a canvas of conflicting emotions. The words seemed too good to be true, a dream he dared not believe. But as his sons shared the details of their encounter, hope began to flicker in Jacob's eyes. Picture the bustling scene as Jacob's family prepared for their journey. Wagons creaked under the weight of belongings, children chattered with excitement, and the air hummed with a sense of anticipation. This caravan carried more than just people and possessions, it carried the promise of a joyful reunion and a new beginning. As they neared Egypt, Joseph's heart raced with excitement. He prepared his chariot, eager to meet his father on the road. Can you feel the mix of nervousness and joy as Joseph scanned the horizon? After years of separation, the moment he had dreamed of was finally at hand. When Joseph caught sight of the approaching caravan, his breath caught in his throat. There, among the travelers, was a familiar figure, older now, but unmistakable. "Father!" Joseph cried out, leaping from his chariot. Jacob looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. Their reunion was a moment of pure, overwhelming emotion. Joseph threw his arms around his father, tears streaming down his face. Jacob clung to his son, his body shaking with sobs of joy. "Now I can die in peace," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I have seen for myself that you are still alive." As you rest there, imagine the tender scene of father and son reunited after so many years. Feel the warmth of their embrace, the years of pain and longing melting away in that single moment. Joseph's journey had come full circle, from the favorite son to the lost brother, and now to the savior of his family. How did Joseph's reunion with his father Jacob unfold? It was a testament to God's faithfulness, a moment of healing for a family long torn apart. In that embrace on the road to Egypt, years of sorrow transformed into joy, and the promise of a new chapter began. Joseph's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope and reconciliation can be just around the corner. Chapter 16. Settling in Goshen. With their hearts full of joy and anticipation, Joseph's family began to settle in the lush land of Goshen. Picture the bustling activity as they unpacked their belongings and marveled at their new home. The fertile fields stretched out before them, promising abundance and a fresh start. Joseph, beaming with pride, showed his family around, pointing out the best grazing lands for their flocks. As the family settled in, Joseph knew it was time to introduce some of his brothers to Pharaoh. Can you imagine their nervousness as they prepared to meet the most powerful man in Egypt? Joseph reassured them, reminding them of Pharaoh's generosity. When they stood before the king, they bowed respectfully, grateful for his kindness. But the most touching moment came when Jacob, Joseph's elderly father, met Pharaoh. Picture this humble shepherd standing before the mighty ruler of Egypt. To everyone's surprise, Jacob raised his hands and blessed Pharaoh. It was a beautiful sight, the simple man of faith offering a blessing to the king of a great empire. Pharaoh was deeply moved by Jacob's gesture, recognizing the wisdom and faith that radiated from this patriarch. As the days turned into weeks and months, Joseph's family began to flourish in their new home. Their flocks grew larger, their crops thrived in the rich soil of Goshen. Children's laughter filled the air as new generations were born. The promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were coming to life before their eyes. Meanwhile, Joseph continued his important work of managing the famine crisis. His wisdom and foresight had already saved countless lives, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that both Egyptians and foreigners had access to food. Can you picture Joseph, now a respected leader, overseeing the distribution of grain with compassion and fairness? Joseph's leadership didn't stop at managing the food supply. He implemented policies that strengthened Pharaoh's rule, ensuring stability throughout the land. His actions earned him even greater respect among the Egyptians, who saw him as a savior in their time of need. As the years passed, the Israelites as Joseph's family came to be known grew in number and influence. What started as a small clan of shepherds blossomed into a significant presence in Egypt. Their unique customs and faiths set them apart, yet they found ways to live peacefully alongside their Egyptian neighbors. Little did they know that the seeds of future events in Israel's history were being planted in these early days in Egypt. The story of their deliverance from famine, their growth as a people, and their special relationship with God would be passed down through generations. It would shape their identity and prepare them for the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. As you rest there, think about how God used Joseph's journey to save his family and set the stage for the future of Israel. From a pit in Canaan to the palaces of Egypt, Joseph's faith and obedience had led to this moment of peace and prosperity for his loved ones. It's a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, God can be weaving a beautiful tapestry of hope and redemption. Chapter 17. Jacob's Final Days. As Jacob's life drew to a close, he felt the weight of his years and the pull of eternity. Can you picture the elderly patriarch, his eyes clouded with age but still shining with wisdom? He called for Joseph, his beloved son, to come to his bedside. As Joseph entered the room, Jacob's face lit up with a tender smile. "My son," Jacob said, his voice weak but filled with love, "promise me that when I die, you won't bury me here in Egypt. Take me back to Canaan, to the land of my fathers. Lay me to rest in the cave where Abraham and Isaac are buried." Joseph nodded, his heart heavy with the thought of losing his father but determined to honor his wishes. Not long after, Joseph brought his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to visit their grandfather. Jacob's eyes brightened at the sight of his grandchildren. "Bring them to me," he said, "so I can bless them." As the boys approached, Jacob did something unexpected. He crossed his arms, placing his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left on Manasseh's. Joseph, noticing this, tried to correct his father. "No, father," he said gently. "This is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But Jacob insisted. "I know, my son, I know. Manasseh too will become great. But his younger brother will be even greater." Can you imagine Joseph's surprise at his father's words? Jacob, guided by God's wisdom, saw a future that others couldn't see. As Jacob's strength began to fade, he gathered all his sons around him. Picture the scene: 12 grown men, some with gray in their beards, gathered around their father's bed. Jacob's voice, though weak, carried the weight of prophecy as he spoke to each son in turn. To Judah he said, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come." His words hinted at the future kingship of David and, ultimately, the coming of the Messiah. To Joseph, he spoke of blessings, as high as the eternal mountains. Each son received a blessing tailored to his character and future. Some blessings were stern warnings, others promises of prosperity. As Jacob spoke, his sons listened intently, aware that these were more than just the father's final words, they were glimpses into God's plan for their future. When Jacob finished blessing his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed. With one last breath, he joined his ancestors in death. Joseph fell upon his father's face, weeping and kissing him. The room filled with the sounds of grief as the brothers mourned their father. As you rest there, think about Jacob's life. From his youthful struggles with his brother Esau to his wrestling match with God, from the pain of losing Joseph to the joy of their reunion, through it all, God had been faithful. Jacob's final days were a testament to that faithfulness, a reminder that God's plans unfold across generations. Jacob's story teaches us that our lives are part of a bigger picture. Like him, we may not always understand God's ways, but we can trust in his faithfulness. As you drift off to sleep, remember that your story, too, is part of God's grand design. Chapter 18. Honoring Jacob's wish. As the sun rose over Egypt, Joseph prepared to fulfill his solemn promise to his father. A grand funeral procession began to form, unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Picture the long line of chariots and wagons, stretching as far as the eye could see. Egyptians and Israelites alike joined the procession, their hearts heavy with grief. Can you imagine the sight as they left Egypt? The air was filled with the sound of mourning, a mix of Egyptian and Hebrew laments rising to the heavens. Joseph led the way, his face a mask of sorrow and determination. As they traveled, people along the route stopped to watch, amazed by the spectacle and touched by the depth of emotion on display. The journey to Canaan was long and arduous. As you rest there, think about the conversations that might have taken place along the way. Perhaps Joseph shared stories of his father with his Egyptian friends, helping them understand the greatness of the man they were honoring. After many days, they finally reached the cave of Machpelah, the ancient burial site of Abraham and Isaac. As they approached, a hush fell over the crowd. Can you picture the brothers carrying Jacob's body into the cave? Their steps were slow and reverent, each feeling the weight of the moment. Inside the cool darkness of the cave, Joseph and his brothers laid Jacob to rest beside their ancestors. Tears flowed freely as they said their final goodbyes. In that moment, surrounded by the past and present of their family, they felt the continuity of God's promises through the generations. As the funeral came to an end and the crowd began to disperse, a new worry crept into the hearts of Joseph's brothers. With their father gone, would Joseph finally seek revenge for their past cruelty? The old fear that had been buried beneath years of reconciliation suddenly resurfaced. In their anxiety, the brothers concocted a plan. They sent a message to Joseph, claiming that before he died, Jacob had asked Joseph to forgive his brothers for their evil deed. As you imagine this scene, can you feel the tension in the air? The brothers waited nervously for Joseph's response, their hearts pounding with uncertainty. When Joseph received their message, his reaction revealed the true depth of his character. Tears welled up in his eyes, not from anger or hurt, but from sadness that his brothers could still doubt his forgiveness. In that moment, Joseph's heart overflowed with compassion for his family. As you drift towards sleep, think about Joseph's journey. From a pit in Canaan to the palaces of Egypt, from slavery to leadership, he had seen God's hand at work in every circumstance. Now, faced with his brother's fear, Joseph had one more opportunity to demonstrate the grace and forgiveness that had become the hallmark of his life. Chapter 19. Joseph's lasting forgiveness. Joseph's tears flowed freely as he read his brother's message. Their words, filled with fear and uncertainty, pierced his heart. How could they still doubt his forgiveness after all this time? As you rest there, picture Joseph's face, a mixture of sadness and compassion etched across his features. With love in his eyes, Joseph gathered his brothers close. "Don't be afraid," he said gently, his voice warm and reassuring. "Am I in the place of God?" These words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of Joseph's humility and faith. He understood that judgment belonged to God alone, and his role was to show mercy and love. Joseph's mind drifted back to those painful days of betrayal and separation. But instead of bitterness, his heart swelled with gratitude for God's plan. "You intended to harm me," he told his brothers. "But God intended it for good." Can you feel the wonder in Joseph's voice as he spoke of God's providence? He saw clearly how each step of his journey, even the painful ones, had led to this moment of salvation for his family and countless others. With arms open wide, Joseph made a beautiful promise to his brothers. "I will provide for you and your children," he declared, his words a soothing balm to their worried hearts. Imagine the relief washing over the brothers' faces as they realized Joseph's forgiveness was complete and lasting. This wasn't just a temporary peace, but a permanent reconciliation. Joseph's act of grace did more than ease his brothers' fears. It cemented the family's unity, healing old wounds and paving the way for a shared future. As you picture this scene, think about the power of forgiveness to transform relationships and bring new life to broken bonds. In the days that followed, Joseph's wisdom and faith continued to guide the family. His experiences had taught him to trust in God's bigger picture, even when circumstances seemed dire. He shared these lessons with his brothers and their children, nurturing a legacy of faith that would endure for generations. What does Joseph's story teach us about God's providence in our lives? It reminds us that God can use even our darkest moments for good. Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace wasn't just about his personal triumph. It was part of God's grand plan to save his people and bless the nations. As you drift towards sleep, reflect on Joseph's unwavering trust in God's plan. His story encourages us to look beyond our current circumstances and believe that God is working all things together for good. Even when we can't see the full picture, we can trust that God's providence is guiding our steps, just as it did for Joseph. Chapter 20. Joseph's Final Days. Joseph's final days were a testament to God's faithfulness and the wisdom he had gained through his incredible journey. Imagine Joseph, now an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, surrounded by his loved ones. He lived to see not just his children and grandchildren, but even his great-grandchildren. Can you picture the joy on his face as he bounced little ones on his knee, telling them stories of God's goodness? Despite his advanced age, Joseph remained an influential figure in Egypt. His wisdom and leadership, honed through years of trials and triumphs, continued to benefit the nation he had once saved from famine. People still sought his counsel, recognizing the divine insight that guided his decisions. As Joseph felt his strength beginning to fade, he knew it was time to gather his brothers one last time. Picture them all assembled around his bed, their own hair now gray, listening intently to their brother's words. Joseph's voice, though softer now, still carried the weight of authority and love. "God will surely come to your aid," Joseph told them, his eyes shining with faith. "He will bring you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Can you feel the mix of sorrow and hope in the room as Joseph reminded them of God's enduring promise? Then, Joseph made a solemn request. "When God comes to your aid and you go up from this place," he said, "you must carry my bones with you." Imagine the brothers nodding solemnly, understanding the deep significance of this wish. Joseph, though he had lived most of his life in Egypt, still longed for the promised land of his fathers. At the age of 110, full of years and wisdom, Joseph breathed his last. As his family mourned, they remembered not just the powerful leader he had become, but the faithful servant of God he had always been. Following Egyptian custom, Joseph's body was carefully embalmed, preserving it for the future journey his bones would make. They placed his body in a coffin in Egypt, a silent reminder of the promise yet to be fulfilled. As you rest there, think about how this coffin would serve as a symbol of hope for generations to come, a tangible reminder that God keeps his promises, even across centuries. How did Joseph's experiences prepare him for leadership? His journey from favored son to slave, from prisoner to ruler, had taught him invaluable lessons. He learned humility in the depths of the pit and the darkness of the dungeon. His time as a slave and prisoner taught him compassion for the suffering of others. The years of interpreting dreams honed his ability to see God's hand at work in all circumstances. Most importantly, Joseph's unwavering faith in God's plan, even in his darkest moments, prepared him to lead with wisdom and grace. He understood that true leadership wasn't about personal power, but about serving others and fulfilling God's purpose. As you drift off to sleep, remember that, like Joseph, your challenges today might be preparing you for the role God has for you tomorrow. Chapter 21. Legacy of Faith. Joseph's story, once a tale of betrayal and hardship, has become a shining example of faith for the Israelites. As you rest there, imagine how his journey from the pit to the palace has inspired countless generations. Joseph's life shows us that God is always in control, even when things seem darkest. Think about how future Israelites will look back on Joseph's story. They'll see a man who never lost faith, even when his own brothers sold him into slavery. They'll remember how he resisted temptation in Potiphar's house and kept his integrity in prison. Joseph's unwavering trust in God will become a model for those facing their own trials. Remember those dreams that got Joseph into so much trouble as a young man? The ones where his brothers bowed down to him? Well, they turned out to be more than just a teenager's fantasy. God was showing Joseph glimpses of the future, preparing him for the role he would play. Those dreams, once a source of jealousy and pain, became a powerful testimony to God's plan. Joseph's wisdom didn't just save Egypt from famine. It saved God's chosen people too. Picture the moment when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. In that act of forgiveness, he preserved the family that would become the nation of Israel. Without Joseph's foresight and faith, the story of God's people might have ended before it truly began. Can you see how Joseph's forgiveness changed everything? It allowed his family to settle in Egypt, where they would grow from a small clan into a mighty nation. In the fertile land of Goshen, the Israelites flourished, protected by Joseph's position and God's favor. Joseph's choice to forgive paved the way for Israel's future. As Joseph's life draws to a close, the stage is set for the next chapter in Israel's history. The small family that arrived in Egypt will become a people so numerous that they'll eventually be seen as a threat. But that's a story for another time. What role did dreams play throughout Joseph's story? They were like signposts from God, guiding Joseph's path. His own dreams as a youth foretold his rise to power. Later, his ability to interpret dreams saved him from prison and brought him to Pharaoh's attention. Even the dreams of others, the cupbearer, the baker, Pharaoh himself, were used by God to position Joseph where he needed to be. As you drift off to sleep, think about the dreams in your own life. Could they be more than just random images? Perhaps, like Joseph, God is using them to prepare you for something greater. Remember, even when life takes unexpected turns, God may be weaving your story into His greater plan, just as He did with Joseph. Chapter 22. Echoes in History. Dreams guided Joseph's path, but what happens when those dreams fade into history? Imagine a time when Joseph's name is no longer remembered in the land he once ruled. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn, setting the stage for one of the greatest epics in biblical history. Joseph's bones remain in Egypt, a silent witness to his remarkable life. The ornate coffin stands as a reminder of the promise he made his brothers that one day, God would lead their descendants back to the promised land. As you picture that coffin, think about the hope it represents for generations to come. Years pass, and the small family that Joseph saved grows into a mighty people. The Israelites multiply, their numbers increasing until they filled the land of Goshen. Can you imagine the bustling villages, the fields teeming with livestock, the sounds of children playing? This flourishing community is a testament to God's faithfulness and Joseph's foresight. But as time marches on, a new Pharaoh rises to power. This ruler knows nothing of Joseph or the great service he provided to Egypt. As he looks out over his kingdom, all he sees is a foreign people growing stronger by the day. Fear takes root in his heart, and he begins to view the Israelites as a threat. The Pharaoh's fear turns to cruelty. He decides to enslave the Israelites, forcing them to build his cities and work his fields. Picture the once free people now bent under the weight of heavy loads, their backs scarred by the taskmaster's whip. The dreams of prosperity that brought them to Egypt have turned into a nightmare of oppression. Yet even in these dark times, God hasn't forgotten his people. He sees their suffering and hears their cries. Just as he used Joseph to save them from famine, he will raise up another deliverer, Moses. As you rest there, think about how God often works in ways we can't see, preparing salvation even in our darkest moments. Moses will lead the people out of Egypt in a dramatic exodus, fulfilling the prophecy Joseph made on his deathbed. And true to their promise, the Israelites carry Joseph's bones with them as they leave. Imagine that ancient coffin, borne on the shoulders of Joseph's descendants, making its final journey home to Canaan. Joseph's life forms a bridge between two great eras of Israel's history. He stands at the end of the patriarchal age, the last of Jacob's sons. Yet his story also sets the stage for Israel's national history, their slavery in Egypt, and their eventual deliverance. In many ways, Joseph's journey from slave to ruler foreshadows the larger story of his people. What lessons can we learn from Joseph's unwavering faith during hardships? His life teaches us that God can use even our darkest moments for good. Joseph never lost sight of God's presence, whether he was in a pit, a prison, or a palace. His story reminds us to trust in God's bigger picture, even when we can't see how our current struggles fit into it. As you drift off to sleep, remember Joseph's example. In your own times of trial, hold on to faith. Like Joseph, you may find that today's challenges are preparing you for tomorrow's triumphs. God's plan often unfolds in unexpected ways, but his faithfulness remains constant through every chapter of our lives. Chapter 23. A Timeless Tale. Joseph's story has a way of touching hearts across cultures and time. It's a tale that speaks to something deep within us all. As you rest there, think about how Joseph's journey mirrors our own struggles and triumphs. Remember those dreams Joseph had as a young man? They weren't just about sheaves of wheat or stars in the sky. They were glimpses of a future Joseph could hardly imagine. His story reminds us that our own dreams, both sleeping and waking, can point us towards a greater purpose. But Joseph's tale isn't all starry nights and golden promises. It carries a warning too. Can you picture Jacob showering Joseph with attention and that famous coat? That favoritism sparked a fire of jealousy in Joseph's brothers. It's a reminder to treat those around us with equal love and respect. Life wasn't easy for Joseph. Imagine being thrown into a pit by your own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and forgotten in prison. Yet each hardship shaped Joseph's character. Those dark days in the dungeon prepared him for the bright halls of Pharaoh's palace. When life gets tough, remember Joseph. Your current struggles might be shaping you for future greatness. One of the most beautiful parts of Joseph's story is his forgiveness. Picture the moment when he revealed himself to his brothers. He could have sought revenge, but instead, he chose love. Joseph's embrace of his family shows us the healing power of forgiveness. It's not always easy, but it can mend even the deepest wounds. As you drift towards sleep, think about how God's hand was at work throughout Joseph's life. Even in the darkest moments, a greater plan was unfolding. Joseph couldn't see it at the time, but each step of his journey was leading him exactly where he needed to be. Joseph's story offers us hope. It shows that even when others intend harm, God can use it for good. The pit, the prison, the palace, all of it worked together to save Joseph's family and countless others from famine. It's a powerful reminder that our own struggles might be part of a bigger picture we can't yet see. How did Joseph's journey fulfill God's greater plan? It preserved the family that would become the nation of Israel. It positioned Joseph to save many lives during the famine. And it became a timeless story of faith, forgiveness, and God's providence. As you close your eyes, remember that like Joseph, your own story is part of God's grand design. Sweet dreams, and may you wake with renewed hope for the chapters yet to come. As we come to the end of Joseph's remarkable journey, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons his life offers us. Joseph's story reminds us that our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, don't have to define our future. Think about Joseph in that dark pit, or languishing in prison. He could have given up hope, but he chose to trust in God's plan. Joseph's life encourages us to look beyond our immediate struggles and trust in God's bigger picture. Even when we can't see how things will work out, God is weaving our story into His grand design. As you rest there, letting sleep gently approach, remember that like Joseph, your dreams both sleeping and waking may be preparing you for a greater purpose. God bless you, and may your night be filled with peaceful sleep and hopeful dreams. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing to our channel to join our community, and for more videos like this. Now I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you on the next video. God bless you.